A suicide attack is a violent attack in which the attacker expects to die in the process. Suicide attacks have occurred throughout history, often as part of a military campaign such as the Japanese Kamikaze pilots of World War II, and more recently as part of terrorist campaigns, such as the September 11th attacks. While there were few if any successful suicide attacks anywhere in the world from the end of World War II until 1980, between 1981 and September 2015, a total of 4,814 suicide attacks occurred in over 40 countries, killing over 45,000 people. During this time, the global rate of such attacks grew from an average of 3 a year in the 1980s, to about 1 a month in the 1990s, to almost 1 a week from 2001 to 2003, to approximately 1 a day from 2003 to 2015. Suicide attacks tend to be more deadly and destructive than other terror attacks because they give the perpetrators the ability to conceal weapons, make last-minute adjustments, and because they dispense with the need for remote delayed detonation, escape plans or rescue teams. They constituted only 4% of all terrorist attacks around the world over one period, but caused 32% of all terrorism-related deaths. 90% of those attacks occurred in Afghanistan, Iraq, Israel, the Palestinian territories, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Overall, as of mid-2015, about three-quarters of all suicide attacks occurred in just 3 countries: Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. Suicide attacks have been described as a weapon of psychological warfare to instill fear in the target population, a strategy to eliminate or at least drastically diminish areas where the public feels safe, and the fabric of trust that holds societies together. The motivation of suicide attackers varies. Kamikaze acted under military orders and were motivated by obedience and nationalism. Before 2003, most attacks targeted forces occupying the attacker's homeland, according to analyst Robert Pape. Anthropologist Scott Atran states that since 2004 the overwhelming majority of bombers have been motivated by the ideology of Islamist martyrdom. Definitions: terrorism. Suicide attacks include both suicide terrorism, often defined as any action intended to cause death or serious bodily harm to civilians and non-combatants for the purpose of intimidation, and suicide attacks not targeting non-combatants. An alternative definition is provided by Jason Burke, a journalist who has lived among Islamic militants, and suggests that most define terrorism as the use or threat of serious violence to advance some kind of cause, stressing that terrorism is a tactic. Academic Fred Halliday has written that assigning the descriptor of terrorist or terrorism to the actions of a group is a tactic used by states to deny legitimacy and rights to protest and rebel. Suicide terrorism. The definition of suicide is another issue. Suicide terrorism itself has been defined by one source as violent actions perpetrated by people who are aware that the odds they will return alive are close to zero. Quote, other sources exclude from the work suicidal or high-risk attacks, such as the Lod Airport massacre or reckless charge in battle, focusing only on true suicide attacks, where the odds of survival are not close to zero, but required to be zero, because the perpetrator's ensured death is a precondition for the success of his mission. Also excluded from the definition are proxy bombings, which may have political goals and may be designed to look like suicide bombing, but where the proxy is forced to carry a bomb under threat and may be unaware they will be killed, and suicidal rampage shootings, which are usually thought of as being driven by personal, psychological, not political, social or religious motives. it may not always be clear to investigators which type of killing is which. Suicide attack campaigns sometimes also using proxy bombers and manipulating the vulnerable to be bombers, and at least one researcher arguing that the motivation to kill and be killed connects some suicide attackers more closely to suicidal rampage murderers than is commonly thought. Usage. The usage of the term suicide attack goes back a long way, but suicide bombing dates back to at least 1940 when a New York Times article mentions the term in relation to German tactics. Less than 2 years later, that newspaper referred to a Japanese kamikaze attempt on an American carrier as a suicide bombing. Quote, in 1945, the Times of London referred to a kamikaze plane as a suicide bomb, and 2 years later an article that referred to a new British pilot-less, radio-controlled rocket missile as originally designed as a countermeasure to the Japanese suicide bomber. Alternative terms, sometimes to assign either a more positive or negative connotation to the act. Suicide bombing is referred to by different terms. Istishhad. Islamist supporters often call a suicide attack istishhad, and the suicide attack a shaheed, the idea being that the attacker died in order to testify his faith in God, for example while waging jihad bis sayf. The term suicide is never used because Islam has strong strictures against taking one's own life. There is a lot of references from Quran and al-Hadith that interdict suicide even if it was for jihad bis sayf. The terms istishhad, martyrdom operation, have been embraced by the Palestinian Authority and by Hamas, al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, Fatah and other Palestinian factions. Homicide bombing. Some efforts have been made to replace the term suicide bombing with homicide bombing, on the grounds that since the homicide is a more apt an adjective than suicide, since the primary purpose of such a bombing is to kill other people. The first to use the term for a wide audience was White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer in April 2002. The only major media outlets to use it are Fox News Channel and the New York Post. Emeritus Professor Robert Goldney of the University of Australia Adelaide has argued in favor of the term homicide bomber, arguing that studies show that there is little in common between people who blow themselves up, intending to kill as many people as possible in the process, and actual suicide victims. Fox News producer Dennis Murray argued that a suicidal act should be reserved for a person who does something to kill themselves only. CNN producer Krista Robinson argued that the term homicide bomber reflects only that you have killed other people, but not that you have also killed yourself. Genocide bombing. Genocide bombing was coined in 2002 by a Jewish member of the Canadian Parliament, Erwin Kotler, in an effort to focus attention on the alleged intention of genocide by militant Palestinians in their calls to wipe Israel off the map. Sacrifice bombing. In the German-speaking area, the term sacrifice bombing was proposed in 2012 by German scholar Arat Takeda. The term is intended to shift the focus away from the suicide of the perpetrators and towards the use as weapons by the commanders. History pre-1980. Until the second half of the 20th century, most suicide attacks occurred in a military context. The 1st century AD Jewish Sicarii sect are thought to have outcarried suicidal attacks against Hellenized Jews they considered immoral collaborators. The Islamic Hashishiyin sect of Ismaili Shia Muslims successfully assassinated 2 caliphs, many viziers, sultans and crusader leaders over the course of of 300 years before being annihilated by Mongol invaders. Hashishin were known for their targeting of the powerful, the use of the dagger as a weapon, and for making no attempt to escape after completing the killing. The earliest known non-military suicide attack occurred in Murchison in New Zealand on 14 July 1905. A long-standing dispute between two farmers resulted in a court case, and the defendant had sticks of gelignite strapped to his body, when Sewell excitedly shouted during the court sitting about the other farmer, "I'll blow the devil to hell, and I have enough dynamite to do just that." He was ushered out of the building. Sewell detonated the charge when a police officer tried to arrest him on the street, and his body was blown to pieces, but nobody else died from their injuries. India. To counter the superior numbers of the Chola dynasty Empire's army in the 11th century, suicide squads were raised by the Indian Chera rulers. This helped the Cheras to resist Chola invasion and maintain the independence of the kingdom from the time of Kulodhunga Chola I. These warriors were known as the Chavas. Later, these suicide squads rendered service as police, volunteer troop and fighting squads in the region. Now the primary duty was to assist local rulers in battles and skirmishes. The rulers of the state of Valavan are known to have deployed a number of suicide squads against the ruler of Calicut, Dutch. In the late 17th century, King official Yu Yonghe recorded that injured Dutch soldiers fighting against Koxinga's forces for control of Taiwan in 1661 would use gunpowder to blow up both themselves and their opponents rather than be taken prisoner. However, the Chinese observer may have confused such suicidal tactics with the standard Dutch military practice of undermining and blowing up positions, recently overrun by the enemy, which almost cost Koxinga his life during the siege of Fort Zeelandia. ACEH Muslim Essenis from the ACEH Sultanate performed suicide attacks known as Parang Sabal against Dutch invaders during the ACEH War. It was considered as part of personal jihad in the Islamic religion of the Essenis. The Dutch called it Achemord. The Essenis' work of literature, the Hikayat Parang Sabal, provided the background and reasoning for the ACEH Mord of Essenis suicide attacks upon the Dutch. The Indonesian translations of the Dutch terms are ACEH Bodo or ACEH Hila. Achemord was also used against the Japanese by the Essenis during the Japanese occupation of ACEH. The Essenis ulama fought against both the Dutch and the Japanese, revolting against the Dutch in February 1942 and against Japan in November 1942. The revolt was led by the All-ACEH Religious Scholars Association. The Japanese suffered 18 dead in the uprising, while they slaughtered up to 100 or over 120 Essenis. The revolt happened in Bayu and was centered around Tjot Plieng village's religious school. During the revolt, the Japanese troops armed with mortars and machine guns were charged by sword-wielding Essenis under Tengku Abdul Jalil in Bulo Gampong Tunga, and Tjot Plieng on 10 and 13 November. On May 1945 the Essenis rebelled again. Moro Juramentado Moro Muslims who performed suicide attacks were called Mag Sabal, and the suicide attacks were known as Parang Sabal. The Spanish called them Juramentado. The idea of the Juramentado was considered part of jihad in the morose Islamic religion. During an attack, a Juramentado would throw himself at his targets and kill them with bladed weapons such as barongs and kris until he himself was killed. The Moros performed Juramentado suicide attacks against the Spanish in the Spanish-Moro conflict of the 16th to the 19th centuries, against the Americans in the Moro Rebellion, and against the Japanese in World War II. The Moro Juramentados aimed their attacks specifically against their enemies, and not against non-Muslims in general. They launched suicide attacks on the Japanese, Spanish, Americans and Filipinos, but did not attack the non-Muslim Chinese, as the Chinese were not considered enemies of the Moro people. The Japanese responded to these suicide attacks by massacring all known family members and relatives of the attacker. According to historian Stefan Dale, the Moro were not the only Muslims who carried out suicide attacks in the fight against Western hegemony and colonial rule. Quote, "In the 18th century, suicide tactics were used on the Malabar coast of southwestern India, in Aceh in northern Sumatra as well. Russia. The first known suicide bomber was Russian. The invention of dynamite in the 1860s presented revolutionary and terrorist groups in Europe with a weapon nearly 20 times more powerful than gunpowder, but with technical challenges to detonating it at the right time. One way around that obstacle was to use a human trigger, and this was the technique that assassinated Tsar Alexander II of Russia in 1881. A would-be suicide bomber killed Vyacheslav von Plehve, the Russian Minister of the Interior in St. Petersburg in 1904. Chinese suicide squads during the Xinhai Revolution and the warlord era of the Republic of China, Dare to Die Corps or suicide squads, were frequently used by Chinese armies. China deployed these suicide units against the Japanese during the Second Sino-Japanese War. In the Xinhai Revolution, many Chinese revolutionaries became martyrs in battle. Dare to Die student corps were founded for student revolutionaries wanting to fight against Qing dynasty rule. Dr. Sun Yat-sen and Hu Wangxing promoted the Dare to Die corps. Hu Wang said, "We must die, so let us die bravely." Suicide squads were formed by Chinese students going into battle, knowing that they would be killed fighting against overwhelming odds. The 72 martyrs of Hu Wang Huigang died in the uprising that began the Wuchang Uprising, and were recognized as heroes and martyrs by the Kuomintang Party and the Republic of China. The martyrs in the Dare to Die Corps who died in battle wrote letters to family members before heading off to certain death. The Hu Wang Huigang was built as a monument to the 72 martyrs. The deaths of the revolutionaries helped the establishment of the Republic of China, overthrowing the Qing dynasty imperial system. Other Dare to Die student corps in the Xinhai Revolution were led by students who later became major military leaders in Republic of China, like Chiang Kai-shek and Hu Wang Shaozhong, with the Muslim Bai Chongxi against Qing dynasty forces. Dare to Die troops were used by warlords. The Kuomintang used one to put down an insurrection in Canton. Many women joined them in addition to men to achieve martyrdom against China's opponents. They were known as Lit Shi after accomplishing the mission. During the January 28 incident, a Dare to Die squad struck against the Japanese. Suicide bombing was also used against the Japanese. A Dare to Die corps was effectively used against Japanese units at the Battle of Taijuang. They used swords. They wore suicide vests made out of grenades. A Chinese soldier detonated a grenade vest and killed 20 Japanese soldiers at Sihang warehouse. Chinese troops strapped explosives like grenade packs or dynamite to the bodies and threw themselves under Japanese tanks to blow them up. This tactic was used during the Battle of Shanghai to stop a Japanese tank column when an attacker exploded himself beneath the lead tank, and at the Battle of Taijuang, where Chinese troops with dynamite and grenades strapped to themselves rushed Japanese tanks and blew themselves up, in one incident obliterating 4 Japanese tanks with grenade bundles. During the 1946 to 1950 Communist Revolution, coolies fighting the Communists formed Dare to Die Corps to fight for their organizations with their lives. During the Tiananmen Square incident of 1989, protesting students also formed Dare to Die Corps to risk their lives defending the protest leaders. Japanese Kamikaze. Kamikaze, a ritual act of self-sacrifice carried out by Japanese pilots of explosive-laden aircraft against Allied warships, occurred on a large scale at the end of World War II. About 3,000 attacks were made and about 50 ships were sunk. Later in the war, as Japan became more desperate, this act became formalized and ritualized, as planes were outfitted with explosives specific to the task of a suicide mission. Kamikaze strikes were a weapon of asymmetric war used by the Empire of Japan against United States Navy and Royal Navy aircraft carriers. Although the armored flight deck of the Royal Navy carriers diminished kamikaze effectiveness, the Japanese Navy also used piloted torpedoes called Kaiten on suicide missions, although sometimes called midget submarines. These were modified versions of the unmanned torpedoes of the time and are distinct from the torpedo-firing midget submarines used earlier in the war, which were designed to infiltrate shore defenses and return to a mothership after firing the torpedoes. Although extremely hazardous, these midget submarine attacks were not technically suicide missions, as the earlier midget submarines had escape hatch. Titans, however, provided no means of escape. Germans during the Battle for Berlin, the Luftwaffe flew self-sacrifice missions against Soviet bridges over the River Oder. These total missions were flown by pilots of the Leonidas Squadron from April 17 to 20, 1945, using any available aircraft. The Luftwaffe claimed the squadron had destroyed 17 bridges. However, military historian Anthony Beaver, when writing about the missions, thinks that this was exaggerated and that only the railway bridge at Kustrinen was definitely destroyed. He comments that 35 pilots and aircraft was a high price to pay for such a limited and temporary success. The missions were called off when the Soviet ground forces reached the vicinity of the squadron's airbase at Deuterbog. Rudolf Christoph Freyr von Gestorff intended to assassinate Adolf Hitler by suicide bomb in 1943, but was unable to complete the attack. Korean War. North Korean tanks were attacked by South Koreans with suicide tactics during the Korean War. American tanks at Seoul were attacked by North Korean suicide squads, who used satchel charges. North Korean soldier Lee Soo-bok is considered a hero for destroying an American tank with a suicide bomb. Suez Crisis. An Arab Christian military officer from Syria, Jules Jamal, allegedly brought down a French ship with a suicide attack during the Suez Crisis in 1956, according to Egyptian media. Although both French ships with the name were unharmed during the crisis,